Ruthless Compassion is a podcast about people who've turned their emotional shit into fertilizer for success. It's about seeing our darkest moments as opportunities for growth and transformation. Julie Lythcott-Haims believes in humans and is deeply interested in what gets in our way. Her work encompasses writing, speaking, mentoring, and activism. She is the New York Times bestselling author of the anti-helicopter parenting manifesto, How to Raise an Adult, which gave rise to a popular TED Talk. Her second book is the critically acclaimed and award-winning prose poetry memoir, Real American, which illustrates her experience as a Black and biracial person in white spaces. A third book, Your Turn, How to Be an Adult, has been called a groundbreakingly frank guide to adulthood. Julie is a former corporate lawyer and Stanford dean, and she holds a BA from Stanford, a JD from Harvard, and an MFA in writing from California College of the Arts. She currently serves on the boards of Common Sense Media and the Black Women's Health Imperative, and on the advisory board of leanin.org and Parents Magazine. She lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her partner of over 30 years, their itinerant young adults, and her mother. Welcome, Julie Lythcott-Haims, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Hi, Marcia. I appreciate your inviting me back, and I'm really excited to engage around ruthless compassion.
Well, I think we need a lot more of it these days, don't we? Absolutely.
Is that true for you up in Toronto? I know here in the USA, that could not be more true these days.
Yeah, we've had quite a lot of protesting recently, and a few unpleasant incidents of people trying to force their way into malls and things like that, and people not willing to play by the rules. So yeah, I think all around we're having some polarization and some very strange thinking on the part of some people, and it's leading to some conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like we've forgotten how to be human. We're just retreating to our little caves. Somehow we have forgotten what it means to be a member of a society, what it means to have to care about others in addition to oneself. It's a very bewildering time. And, the comfort I take is knowing that our ancestors went through far worse. We are in the aggregate improving. We are becoming more civilized. I do believe that is true, but boy, does it feel like we're in the middle of the 2 steps backward period. When we think about 1 step forward, 2 steps back, we definitely seem to be stumbling right now.
Yeah, I was watching a show. It's a very popular show here on our local public television called The Agenda with Steve Paikin. And Steve was interviewing a man named Tom Nichols, who's American. And he just put out a book called Our Own Worst Enemy, about how when people don't care about anyone other than themselves and their close circle of friends and family, there can be no cooperation and therefore no democracy. And he says that that's really what's going on these days.
Yeah. And I think when you look at societies that are multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, it is very easy to turn against everybody else, the groups that are not like you, and turn very inward to your own group. I mean, I think one of America's greatest qualities is the rich diversity here. I'm always proud of that at the Olympics. When you see the countries march in, there are few countries as diverse, at least on the face of it, in terms of phenotype and skin color and so on. Few countries as diverse as the United States of America. And yet it is such an opportunity then to point fingers and polarize. And, it's interesting to me that our strength is also an opportunity for great weakness.
I always think back to the old curse, may you live in interesting times. Yeah. Well, before we go any further, what I usually do at the beginning, which is to get you to just introduce yourself and tell the listener, just remind them who you are and what you do, so we have a little context.
Sure thing. So, as is evident from our first few moments, I'm an American. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm 53. I'm a Black and biracial person. That is, I'm the child of an African-American father and a white British mother. And two of them fell in love at a time when many in society were aghast at such a thing. So I arrived to a couple who transgressed the norms of society just by daring to fall in love and to marry and to have a child. And I have come to an awareness that I have always known somewhere inside of me that my existence transgresses the rules of society, that I am out of bounds, that I am the other, that I am problematic. I certainly got those messages as a young child from strangers and friends and teachers and coworkers as I grew up. And I'm saying all of this because I am an author. I write nonfiction. I write narrative nonfiction. I'm trying to tell the truth of our experience as much as I can bear it. I know that when we can dare to be vulnerable, to open up, to remove the facade and the mask, and actually speak into our real lived experiences and feelings, we help others feel less alone, and we ourselves heal through the telling. So that's my work at a meta level. I come to this from having practiced law for some time, from having been a university dean, and now I write books and speak about various topics as my primary work, and it brings me joy.
That's amazing. And how did you get into the writing? Because I write too, and I always find it so interesting how people kind of get into that arena. What was it that drew you to writing?
Ruthless compassion. I was a university dean at a very well-known campus, Stanford University, right up the road from me, my own alma mater. It's where I went to university as an undergraduate, and I was working with students for years, and way too many of them were desperately unfamiliar with their own selves by way of choice making, problem solving, coping. They were highly accomplished, incredibly bright, but way too many of them had not been allowed to chart their own path. They were just really, really excellent at meeting other people's expectations. And I could see that this was harming them. Didn't matter how impressive their accomplishments were on paper. These were too many young people who were unfamiliar with their own self. Existentially impotent was the term that I coined, and I wanted to do something about it. I wanted to figure out what was going on, what had changed in childhood, what was happening, and I traced it back to changes in parenting. And that's what led me to start to write about the harm of this uber control. My first piece on the subject was an op-ed in the Chicago Tribune called "When Did Caring Become Control? Blame Boomers." And I'm not trying to blame, I am Gen X, so yeah, okay, I'll point my finger at boomers, but the baby boomer parents were really the first to overparent en masse, to hold on to their children always, sort of holding them on their shoulder or on their hip, even though they were 15 and 18 and 20 and 25, doing for them what you intrinsically know a young person needs to learn to do for themselves. And it really became a way to parent in many communities, particularly more affluent communities. And my compassion for these young who were effectively on a leash, even though they were grown. They could have been in the army, and yet their parents were still holding them on a leash, holding them by the hand. And I worried. My compassion for them made me want to try to write about it, made me want to go back to school and get an MFA in writing to develop the confidence that I had what it took to write prose across 300 pages. So that's the answer, compassion.
Wow, yeah. And obviously the ruthlessness, which is the part about seeing the truth of the problem without, casting judgment, but just laying it out and exploring solutions, right?
Well, I did cast judgment. I think that's important to say. This is a problem. Parents are harming their kids, and I'm not going to mince words about that. I am compassionate for parents who do it. I happen to be a parent who's doing it. That was the real aha. I was critiquing a situation, and then some years into my critique, I discovered, oh, hell, I'm doing it. I'm cutting my 10-year-old son's meat. 10 is too old to be having your food cut by a parent. And of course, I just told the story the other day, and someone was like, oh, no, I'm cutting my 15-year-old's meat. And I said, you need to stop, with a smile. I said, you need to stop. And she's like, well, I just looked at her like, are you kidding me? So, I get why we do it. It's easier, it's quicker, it's neater if we do it. But we are totally missing the point of parenting, which is raise this young person to be able to thrive without you. So I have a concern / judgment. I'm not judging you, you're a bad person, but I am judging what you've chosen to do. And I'm very in it myself, having done it myself. And I bring a lot of compassion to parents about why our egos are so wrapped up in our kids' existence, such that we have to do everything for them. And I bring a lot of compassion for the kids whose skills are undermined, but also whose mental health is undermined by being overparented.
So you were saying, you threw something and you said, especially in affluent families. And I was talking to a colleague of mine, and he was saying that he feels like kids who are raised in single parent families and sort of lower income families tend to do better because they have more responsibility put on them, and they are, they have to grow up. Whereas kids from more affluent families have nannies, they have, these parents who do everything. And so they are essentially crippled by, never getting a chance to learn or to fail or to problem solve.
I 100% agree with your colleague. I saw that playing out on my campus in exactly the ways you just described. And the way that I explain it shorthand is, you've got to have some time and money on your hands in order to completely intervene in the life of another person. If you are a working class person, just trying to make ends meet, maybe working a couple jobs, in an environment where you don't have a lot of flexibility around how you construct your time, you can't drop everything and drive the backpack your kid forgot to school. These rescue behaviors, bringing the forgotten homework, the forgotten sporting equipment, the forgotten clarinet, arguing with teachers and heads of school and principals and coaches and umpires and referees. That's a function of, hey, I know I have the right to argue with these adults. If we are lower class, we tend not to feel empowered to speak up to authority. And so we aren't, therefore, with lacking time, extra money, and maybe a sense of empowerment at arguing with authority figures, our kids become the ones who have to kind of figure a little bit more out for themselves. So it's this beautiful irony that kids we think of as underserved, and in many ways are, may nevertheless develop a strength from that childhood that their more affluent peers lack.
Oh, I agree too, because I think of my own experience in having to cook dinner for the whole family at age 15, because my parents were both out working and I was the oldest, and it was like, okay, kiddo, make the dinner. And it was just an expectation, and nobody was going like, can she do it? Do we need to help her? Do we need to cut up all the vegetables first? It's like, okay, make dinner. And you know what? I made dinner, and I did it for, however many years I had to do it until, the situation changed. But there was no babysitter or nanny to make the dinner. It was me. Yeah. And then I had to clean up after. And, it's like, that's just the way it was. And I credit that for, teaching me, first of all, how to cook and how to feel confident, how to feel empowered, how to feel, like self-sufficient. My transition to adulthood was not difficult because I was already doing so many of those tasks before I hit actual adulthood.
Right. I think, people listening may be like, well, wait a minute, what Marcia experienced sounds kind of rough and tumble and maybe, harsh. And it was a fact of life. It was perhaps an element of, the fact that both of your parents were working, maybe your socioeconomic circumstance. It was an expectation. You did it. You weren't suffering. You weren't, left alone and, had to fend off the wolves. You developed some real skills. Today, I think what's happened is we've swung the pendulum in the opposite direction. If one can afford to, it's every moment of childhood is attended and managed and handled. The kids are never asked to chop the vegetables. They're never asked to do any chores. They're never expected to learn how to do things. And they emerge from this childhood incapable. And then we wonder why they're bewildered as young adults. The sweet spot is, even when you have money, even when you have nannies, even when you have ease and leisure time, you got to remember, if you're a grown-up with a strong work ethic, you know how to earn a living, you know how to pay your bills, you got that way for a reason. Why are you depriving your own kids of the very life experiences that are going to build that work ethic, that sense of roll up your sleeves and pitch in, that sense of let me try to figure out what, my parents or the boss or my colleagues need. Let me be useful. And we've got to provide that in our homes. And frankly, the easiest way to provide that is to instill the expectation from very young that kids will participate in chores around the house, that housekeeping, homemaking, the work of life is something everybody participates in. That develops a work ethic. And it's a beautiful way to ensure that when your kid does leave your home, they'll know how to take care of business in that first apartment that they rent.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I never felt like it was an ordeal or anything like that. It was just, this is just what you do, right? Everyone had their roles.
Right. You feel useful, Marcia. I mean, Nicolene Duclef wrote about this in her new book, Hunt, Gather, Parent. There's a psychological sense of belonging that comes when the parent signals, hey, take care of that, please. It's not, oh, gee, I got to deal with that. It actually is, I belong here. I'm valued. I contribute. I matter. And that helps construct this healthy sense of self, this healthy sense of belonging, this healthy sense of relationship that becomes a protective factor for kids when life gets hard, when things fall apart, when things are bad, when something goes wrong. They have this strong protective sense of, but I'm a part of this family. They miss me when I'm not here. I'm expected to show up. If I don't, I let others down. I will contribute. It turns out to be really, really psychologically valuable.
So you've been writing books, as you say, and you just wrote another book called Your Turn, How to Be an Adult. Yeah. And I think that's a very compelling title. And I was just wondering, what kind of solutions or what kind of, thoughts are you sharing in terms of how to be an adult with these young people today, especially those who've been disadvantaged by overparenting?
Yeah. So the book doesn't presume every reader has been overparented, but knows that some have. I define adulthood, adulting, as the period of life you enter if you've survived childhood. So there's nothing, magical about it. I mean, it is magical, and yet it's just called life once you survive childhood. And the major distinction is in childhood, you're more or less the responsibility of others. If your parents have the basic wherewithal to provide food and shelter, you are their responsibility, which is something available to most children. And then in adulthood, you are more or less your own responsibility. Okay. You get up every day knowing, hey, I got to take care of my body, my bills, my belongings, etc., as opposed to, oh, someone else will handle everything for me. And, we make that transition slowly over the teenage years, as you've just illustrated. You began making dinner at 15 for your entire family. So that's the distinction. As an adult, you are more or less the responsibility for yourself, the responsibility of yourself. And you got to be interested in that, lean into that, learn the things you don't know, take a humble learner's mentality, ditch perfectionism, embrace the fact that you're here to learn and grow. You will get progressively better. The older you get, the more you realize every adult is winging it often, and that's okay. It isn't about, I'm amazing. It's about, I'm trying, I'm doing my best here. It's about your character being just as important as anything else, if not the most important thing. I think it's very fundamentally in this book about this is your life. This isn't anyone else's. There isn't a lockstep plan. There isn't a right track you are failing to be on, as many young people seem to believe, because they've been taught in childhood, you got to do this and that and this and that to please the system, to please others. I am here in this book saying, to hell with that. This is your one wild and precious life, quoting the late poet Mary Oliver. And it's on you over time to figure out what it is you want to do with this life. What are you good at? What do you love? What's the Venn diagram intersection of those things? That should be your work. And it's going to take years to figure that out. And that's normal and okay. And I'm rooting for you to make your way. That's probably, it's a huge book. And I think, though, that is the dominant theme within it. It is not anyone else's life. They do not have the right to tell you what to be doing for a living, or what your identity should be, or who you should fall in love with, or where you should live. And that's probably the stuckedness that many young people find themselves in. And I'm trying to crack it wide open with a hammer.
Well, I think about, platforms like Instagram, where people present these very manicured, cultivated personas and existences that are completely false, of course, but others believe them, and then they try to emulate them. And so people start to feel very stressed and overwhelmed because they're not able to create an existence that resembles that of those, Instagram influencers. And, how do you see the effects of social media on young people making choices about their lives today?
Well, the Wall Street Journal just wrote a piece on how Facebook was aware that Instagram was harming teenage girls at this level of identity, sense of self, the psychological impact of all this comparison. And I think we're only just beginning to understand all of that and its complexity, there's further research from Common Sense Media, on whose board I sit, that goes into more nuance. It says, if you bring a healthy psychological self to Instagram, that is, if you yourself, are experiencing mental wellness, social media doesn't negatively or positively impact you. In other words, you know who you are, and all of this stuff in your feed is just information. But if you bring an unwell self to the viewing of social media, then you are highly impacted. You feel better about yourself when good things happen, and worse about yourself when bad things happen or bad comparisons occur. So it's complicated. My solution is I try to show up on social media telling the real deal. I post about the real life shit that happens. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear in your podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. But I'm when I scroll, I'm looking for people who are looking for help. When people I'm having a bad day, I may not know them. I'll just comment, I see what you're posting. I'm sorry, things are hard. I hope tomorrow is better. I am trolling for the people who are reaching out and looking to be seen, not in their amazing curated life, but in their real life, where they're maybe feeling sad or feeling alone or what have you. And I think more of us could do that. I think there is tremendous upside to social media in that you can find people whom you might never have been able to find. You can find people who share a diagnosis, or who share a condition, or who share a way of life that, maybe isn't terribly common in your own community. You can connect. It's really, I think, not in my view, and I'm not a researcher. I have not personally studied this, but based on what I've read in my own experience, it's how we use social media that we really need to invest in. Not is it good or bad, but really how can we all show up in a manner that is more authentic and allows others to be more authentic and to feel safe and seen as they are.
So you're talking about authenticity a lot, and I'm thinking, I'm playing a little devil's advocate here. So I'm thinking of some young people I know in their early 20s, and I'm thinking, how do they go about, making the decision to be authentic? How do they get the support around them to be more authentic, to tune in to who they are and what they want, and to follow their truth? What will support the young people today in pursuing authenticity in all their life choices?
Well, there's that book you mentioned that I wrote, Your Turn, How to Be an Adult. I highly recommend it. I recommend you read it with your friend group. There's a study guide at the back with 4 fairly straightforward, yet I think provocative questions at the end of each chapter. One of the questions, for example, is, whose approval am I seeking? Whose judgment do I fear? A group of 20-somethings sitting around on a Thursday night after work, poring over questions like this, where there's some food and some drink and some soft, cushiony spaces, and everybody agrees to put their phones to the side for an hour and a half and just try to lean into some bigger questions. That's a great way to tap into what's really going on inside of you. You get some support because you're listening to what other people are sharing. You feel less alone. You start to generate some confidence. You start to generate some excitement, some ideas, maybe some commitments about things you might do a little differently around work, around relationship. So I guess my answer is find a small group of people whom you trust and who trust you, and throw out the question, hey, what's keeping us from feeling like we can be authentic? Let's talk about that.
There's also a lot of incredible stress these days, I think, for a young person, a person who's just starting out in their life, because there's the environment. That's, the catastrophe of our environment. There's the political polarization, which we had touched on earlier in the conversation. There's all the, racism and hatred that's really raised its ugly head even worse than ever. And there's the economic situation for young people. Today, there's that downward social spiral where young people are less likely to be able to purchase a home, less likely to have more children because they can't afford it. So what do all of these, pressures do for a young person trying to think about, who they are, who they want to love, and what they want to do?
Yeah, I'm just sitting with that. I appreciate that you said all that. And I 100% agree that these are the macro forces that we're all contending with right now. And boy, the impact that these forces have on people just emerging into their adult life has got to be huge, of course, and Humans have always found their way forward. We know this. Young people have a tremendous facility with technology. They solve problems in a much more facile way than their elders across many measures. They appreciate diversity within the human population more than any generation prior has. They hold such promise within them. And so I actually have tremendous hope that this impatient moment, this scary, urgent moment is going to lead to great shifts, great positive shifts. I was at a conference recently called Power Shift, and somebody was pointing out, I mean, the theme of the conference was the new Renaissance. And they were saying the bubonic plague centuries ago led to the Renaissance. And maybe it's time for a new Renaissance. Maybe all of this shit that's happening is going to result in some massive changes. And I think the younger millennials and older Gen Zs are perfectly suited to the task. Here's a very practical answer, because that was sort of, what could happen, big picture. Very practically, it is really hard to afford to live in the San Francisco Bay Area. And the same may be true in Toronto. I don't know.
Yes.
Right? It's hard to live in certain big cities right now because wages and salaries have not kept up with the cost of living. And there's a whole lot we could say around blame and why that is, but the fact of it is undeniable. And so I think, I'm picturing young people as sort of this, or our society is this balloon that's blown up, and you just squeeze it because, well, you can't do this, you can't live here. Well, what happens when you squeeze a balloon? It just, pops itself out in a different direction. And I think that is very possibly what will happen. There are plenty of cities in my country, and I imagine in yours, where there are jobs, there's great nightlife, it's the perfect vibe for young adults, and the cost of living is affordable. And they tend to be not on the coast. They tend to be inland, which, may be a better place to live for climate change. And so I think what I'm saying is maybe another migration is afoot. People deciding with friend groups, let's strike out and see what we can make of ourselves in Columbus. There are great jobs there. It's great, great city. I can afford to live there. And we may see that happening. I don't know, but I think what I'm getting at is they will take matters into their own hands and do what they need to do to survive and thrive. Humans always have, and I'm confident this generation will too.
We've been seeing that here in the greater Toronto area. A lot of people are moving into the small towns, all, around north, east, and west of Toronto, and northeast and northwest. So every little small town surrounding the big city, people are going out to buy their starter homes, to buy their, forever home even. With COVID, the downtown core emptied out because people didn't need to be downtown because everyone was working from home. So they were moving to the suburbs. So, we saw it before the pandemic, and the pandemic has just increased the exodus from the downtown core. So, for example, one young person I know who was moving from a small town into Toronto was able to find cheaper rent because there were so many empty apartments for the first time in forever, because usually you cannot find a reasonably priced apartment in Toronto downtown area. But because everyone has moved, now there are a few places. I think that will shift again. But yeah, things are definitely shifting and people are making that choice. So I think, here is not very different than the United States.
Yep.
So another thing I was thinking about, and this is a little bit of a darker thing, but there's like an opioid crisis right now. And I'm wondering how that affects the youth of today. It seems like a lot of people are turning to drugs and alcohol as well, but specifically opioids to deal with the stress of their lives. Have you seen that as well?
I know very little about this. I mean, I read about it like everybody does. My new book, Your Turn, tries to tell with compassion and frank bluntness how humans construct meaningful adult lives. And I tell my own stories, but I also invited storytellers from all walks of life into my pages. And there are 31 such people, one of whom is the child of an opioid addict. And so we get his story told from about age 21, looking back on that struggle of having to be the adult in his home with an addicted mother. His father had passed away, and, he had a little sister, and boy, did that grow that kid up. And, I put his voice in these pages to show what it sounds like when somebody is doing their darndest to craft a better life out of some really troubling circumstances. I also have folks in this book who are themselves addicts. I profile somebody who's an alcoholic and has been in recovery for years, but I put her in these pages because addiction is a very real and normal, in that it happens to so many people, aspect of life. And as with any hardship we go through, we try to avoid getting into hardships. We try to avoid becoming addicted. We try to avoid going down that bad path, but sometimes we end up there, and it tends to be our fellow humans who help pull us out of that pit. We have to largely do the work ourselves, but it is a kind, caring human or two in our lives who, can lean in and say, I'm concerned, I'm really worried. And we might be angry at them. I was just listening to Cheryl Strayed's podcast, Dear Sugars, this morning, and they're talking about this. When do you intervene in somebody's life? And noting that often when you do intervene, when you do speak up, they are mad at you. They are mad that you've chosen to sort of put this mirror up and say, look at yourself. And it may be that they never thank you. That may be that they are never grateful, but it may be that regardless, that what you had bravely said becomes a stepping stone for them toward greater awareness and toward healing and recovery.
As you were saying at the beginning, how, we really need community. We need compassionate others, and we cannot just be thinking about ourselves and our just, 2 or 3 people around us. We have to be members of society. We have to be humans, and good humans think about their society, their community, and they reach out to one another, even when someone might not like it, right? Because it's doing the right thing, even if it's not the popular thing.
Absolutely. The quote by Margaret Mead, or the discovery Margaret Mead made. I'm sorry, I'm not a student of Margaret Mead, so I'm sort of trying to allude to something I've read. So Margaret Mead was a cultural anthropologist here in the US, and she defined civilization as the evidence that humans care for and about each other, that it wasn't tools, it wasn't fire, it's the healed femur that demonstrates that a human long ago, this is a fossil that they found of a human skeleton, the femur, the leg bone, was broken and had healed nicely. And she said the fact of that bone having been healed means the person who broke their leg was not left behind. A person with a broken leg, particularly back in, centuries and millennia ago, was not able to fend for themselves, could not procure food, could not procure shelter. They needed to be cared for until that leg healed. And this fossil that they found is evidence of that at some point, humans began not just leaving each other at the side of the road when somebody was, broken, ailing, harmed, hurt, but they were cared for. And I just think that's so beautiful to think of our ancestors of long ago shifting out of this kind of just look after yourself, wilderness, animalistic sense to, no, I'm gonna, at some hardship to me, perhaps, I am going to, make sure that I keep an eye on this person. I'm going to make sure I bring them food. I'm going to make sure I'm looking out for them. I'm going to keep them safe. So this person didn't die of a broken leg. The leg had healed and had mended completely. It was a mended bone. That was not the source of their demise. So anyway, for what it's worth, I think we've got to imagine for ourselves, what is today's equivalent of that? That in those days, I shouldn't really tell the story without knowing all the facts, but this was a long ago occurrence, and it was ruthless compassion, I think, in its time. And I think, your podcast is such a beautiful name, and I think it requires us to ask, what is today's equivalent of that healed femur? What are each of us doing in our lives, in our families, in our communities, in our relationships, in our workplaces, What are we doing to practice that ruthless compassion instead of that rugged individualism for which America is in some ways known, which is not, it's all about me. I'm a lone actor. I don't need anybody and I have no obligation to others. I just reject that. I know plenty of people believe in it. That's not what I believe. I am delighted to be a member of a society where humans care about humans and ruthless compassion is required.
Yeah, I mean, ruthless compassion is required if you're going to tell somebody, hey, I'm very worried about your substance use, because they might get angry. So you have to take that risk of making them not like you or not want to talk to you, but you're doing it because you care. And, saying the truth, right? Where people might not like it and you're not going to be popular. That's ruthless compassion, because, you're sticking your neck out and saying something that might not be well received, but it's the truth and it needs to be said and it needs to be heard. So yeah, we need more of that. We need more of that caring with a little bit of a backbone.
Yeah. I just found her quote. She said, the first evidence, this is Margaret Mead, the first evidence of civilization was 15,000 years ago, a fractured femur found in an archaeological site. She explained, no animal survives a broken leg long enough for the bone to heal. A broken femur that has healed is evidence that someone has taken time to stay with the one who fell, has bound up the wound, has carried the person to safety, and has tended the person through recovery. My goodness, I have chills as I read that.
That's very moving.
Yeah.
So we were able to do that 15,000 years ago, but somehow we're struggling to do that in the 21st century.
Exactly. Yeah. And why is that? What has fallen away? What have we lost? A few things come to mind. In our education system, our public education system in America, over these many decades, we seem to have stopped teaching civics, the sense of how our government works, what a democracy is, what one individual's role and responsibility is within that framework. I'm not sure why. We have simultaneously become achievement obsessed and rigor obsessed. So we teach art and music less in favor of the sciences. And so we have, science, math, no civics, very little art and music. And we wonder why we're so broken. I mean, not to diss math and science, those things are important. Everything needs to be in balance, though. That's one thought. Another thing is our religious institutions aren't as well attended. And I'm not a particular proponent of religion, but religion was a way, or religious communities were places in which humans gathered. There were rituals, there were ways of coping, there were conversations about difficult stuff. Many of our old groupings, whether religion or community, societies, were very gendered. Only men, only women. We're very limited to a particular set of people. And in some ways, we have emerged from those segregations to be a community that is much more integrated. And we've discarded these old ways. It used to be that women didn't work outside the home, and they created the fabric, the network in their community of checking in and caring about and multi-generational support around housekeeping and child rearing and all of that. I'm not longing for the days when women didn't work outside the home. I'm noting that we have discarded many of our old ways in furtherance of equality and opportunity and people being treated equally. It is upon us, therefore, to figure out in our new integrated, evolved way of being, okay, where are the small groups then? If we're not relegating this group over there and this group has to be over there and they have to, like, what are the ways in which we can gather that are utterly 21st century and that are real and that are respectful of differences and yet are intimate and are trusting and are close? I think that's something we need more of in my country, and I'd wager perhaps in yours.
Absolutely.
Small, intimate gatherings where people know they're safe and seen and heard and not alone.
Yeah, and where caring is the fundamental underlying principle.
Yeah.
And caring and letting people be who they are, like you say, being supporting people being authentic.
Yeah.
As opposed to competitive.
Yeah.
So that's a nice kind of note to kind of stop at. I wanted to ask, obviously you've got this big book that you're promoting, but is there Any particular work that you'd like to mention for the listener to look into, or is it the book?
Well, I'd love for folks to get the book. It's available in all formats. If you like the sound of my voice, I narrated the audiobook, but it's available in ebook format and hardcover as well. But then it's about 6 months old. And my newest thing that's just a few weeks old is an online community I'm developing called Julie's Pod. It's available at lythcott-haims.bulletin.com. So Bulletin is a new platform for writers to write short form. And I write there about once a week. And it's called Julie's Pod. And I invite you to comment. And if you're not comfortable commenting in person, I have a hotline, a confidential voicemail number that goes with it, 1-877-HI-JULIE. And so folks can call that line, tell me what's on their mind. I listen, I aggregate the calls, I report back out on Facebook Live periodically. I don't ever share anybody's identity, but I just say somebody called about this. And this is my effort, because my writing is about trying to tell the truth of whatever I'm dealing with, whether it's friendship or vulnerability or something happening in the news. I'm writing about what I feel. I'm inviting people to comment about what they feel. And if they don't feel comfortable commenting in person, I'm offering this phone number where they can still participate. And I'm super excited about it, really starting to gain some traction there. And so if that sounds appealing or interesting, I'm on social media everywhere, J. Lythcott-Haims. And for Julie's Pod, it's jlythcott-haims.bulletin.com. So follow me there. You can subscribe and it'll come to your inbox. It's free. That's my newest thing. And it's totally bringing me joy to connect with humans in this way.
That sounds like a really great project. I'm very happy that you shared that. And just to finish off, what call to action would you give to the listener? I know we've covered on a lot of topics today, but if there's one thing that you feel, compelled to encourage people to consider, what would that be?
Bottom line is humans are everything, that we are a social species, that we do desperately need one another. The pandemic has shown us that. And so I encourage you to level up your game with other humans. And the specific offering or call to action is, if you have a partner or spouse, tomorrow in the morning, roll over, say to that person with a smile, "Baby, what can I do to make today easier for you?" And just watch how that levels up that relationship in that moment, and maybe in that day, maybe across the week. We are quite capable of being extraordinarily kind to one another. Just the act of asking somebody, "Is there anything I can do to make today easier for you?" Or "What could I do to make today better for you?" Just being asked makes a person feel better. And it's the kind of thing that has a ripple effect. You ask it, they might ask it back, and somebody, they might do something kind for somebody else. And then all of a sudden, in the face of the systemic inequality and the resurgence of white supremacy and racism and a pandemic and climate change and all of these things that are out of our control, we are very much in charge of how we behave with our fellow humans. And that turns out to be worth a hell of a lot.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, Julie Lythcott-Haims, for coming on the podcast again. It's very different time between the first time you came on and this time. The world has changed considerably, but I think that the principles of human kindness and compassion will never go out of style, no matter what the times we're living in.
Marcia, I agree with that. And I want to thank your listeners for sticking with us to this point. I want to offer this, whatever came up for you, listener, whatever resonated, whatever made you nod your head or say, "Yep, she's talking to me," that matters. Pay attention to that. Be curious about what came up for you. There's more there for you. And I encourage you to take it forward, whatever it may be.
That was the inspiring Julie Lythcott-Haims, and I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. If you like this podcast, please review it wherever you listen. And you can sign up for my free biweekly wellness newsletter at marciasirotamd.com, where you'll also learn about my new online courses and my YouTube series on coping with COVID.